Warning: this chapter contains loud noises and descriptions of a graphic nature. A and Egg by Cáel Louw. Chapter 34. Max's leathery arms closed around Cáel and they dropped. The scout crowed at the weightlessness of the freefall before the mem flipped him onto his back. To land with a grace Cáel would definitely deny he envied. Besides for the hum of the generators, there was no sound down here. The feared screams and war cries of the battle raged far above them, and faded under the electric pulse and amber glow, the only place more illuminated from the floor beneath the lab. Cáel slipped from the mem's back, and his feet slid, then stuck in the remains of a civilian engineer. The blood glowed red-black under the low light, metal floor carpeted in iron and coagulant. Eerie, the scout muttered to himself. How did they get through so fast? The memph at his side hissed at the smell of copper surrounding them, although to him it smelt of food. Food he'd been starved of for far too long. Cáel vaguely wondered how he knew that Max had been a scavenger back before he knew of his transformation abilities. Wondered how he knew now that the memph was hungry and not something else. It wasn't something he guessed. He knew it in his bones, that the guy was fighting the urge to feed on his natural food source in case he didn't get to do it again. They're all dead anyway, the scout offered offhandedly. I doubt they'll mind. Their loved ones might, Max growled, before his head twitched up towards the darkened corners, where the light from the generators didn't reach. Two guardians stepped out of the shadows, calm as the death at their feet. They stared down at the sepsis and the betrayer. If only their queen would let them. Cáel didn't know how he knew that either. Then she emerged from between them and into the amber light, the most beautiful of their kind save for the original. Cáel cringed. Those thoughts were not his own either. Hello, child, the queen purred, her voice low and distorted, sickly sweet in the way one might speak to a bratty child before a thrashing. We haven't seen you in many moons. Why not kill the human and come back home with us? Max's mouth pulled back in a grimace as he resisted the urge to do as she said. A week ago, he wouldn't have been able to deny her a direct order. But this was different. She had just asked him to kill family. That fangless is not your family, she hissed, her grotesquely pleasant smile morphing into a complete and utter disgust. You were chosen by Mother Nature to surpass the old kind in every way. As one of them, you were injured and dying. As one of us, I was alone and constantly terrified, you bitch, Max roared back at her. Okay, I hate to interrupt, Cáel hummed, but are we going to fight or what? The queen growled lowly. Spines all along her arms vibrated with the sounds, and the guardians twitched, barely perceptible, but Max saw it. The queen pointed at Cáel. Go play, my pets. Guys, Dylan hissed as he pushed Trix through the clinic doors and turned to slash a memph across the stomach. These memphs are getting pretty close. Someone shoved a pistol into his hands, and he shot at one directly behind it, but he was too late to save the soul it had ripped through. Another creature screamed at its fallen kin and charged. The tech pulled the trigger, and the clip clicked empty. His daggers went up, and something heavy slammed down on his shoulder. It sounded like an explosion went off in his ears as the memph flew back, minus half its face, and into another so hard, bones broke and the whiplash snapped its neck in an instant. A new clip slipped into his blood-soaked palm, and he was shoved out the way to make space for Ukwa and Mandla to take his place on the precipice. He looked around to see several of the remaining citizens rush forward, guns in their hands and murder in their eyes. The tech couldn't stop the smile that split his face and joined the firing squad as they moved like a wave into the chaos of war. The Memphs began to fall back towards the scouts that dropped from the broken elevator shaft and their nest in the trees. "Where the hell have you been?" Dylan smoked over the comms. "We were nesting," Maish chuckled. He sounded half as mad with bloodlust. "Perimeter's clear. Time for the center of this pie." "How can you think about food right now?" Yana's voice scolded. "I wouldn't mind a shot, though." They each pulled their little pills from hidden pockets, cheersed, and swallowed their shots. The amber glow from the cells in their gauntlets intensified, a warm light that bounced off the red that stained the floor and lit the pair eerily. The hum of weapons turned loud as the remaining scouts followed their lead. It was time to turn the tables on these monsters. Cáel ducked as claws came at his face, and he barely managed to jump out of the way in time for the Guardian to fly past him. It went headfirst into a generator. Its body jerked as power surged through it. Shattered glass and howling metal faded when he wasn't as fast on the next attack, and a fist the size of his head knocked him clean off his feet. "Max, a little help here," he hissed at the petrified half-breed as he rolled back onto his feet. These guys were stronger than the one from the farmhouse and deliberately playing with him. Bloody sucked. "Why would he do that?" The Queen laughed degradingly as she watched her guardians throw the little sepsis around. She'd once had cats who had done the same with laser pointers, but that was her old life. "You are less than." Ignoring the monster bitch, Cáel took the arm off one guardian. Its howl was louder than anything he'd heard so far. "Max, kick her ass!" he encouraged, before he skid beneath the guardian, only to launch himself at its back. His bracer found its mark in the back of its neck, and it went face first into yet another generator. The city lurched to a halt. It had obviously lost too many Cebus cells to keep moving. Damien was going to be pissed. Cáel pulled the blade free, ready to face the Queen, but the electrocuted Guardian stood in his way, yellow teeth bared and smelling distinctly like something Cáel vaguely remembered as an overdone hamburger. He really shouldn't be enjoying this as much as he was. It lunched, but he was faster. The betrayer had the damn gall to growl at her before he vaulted himself at his mother. Her orders ignored and her pet broken out of his stupor to attack his true ruler? Under the command of a lesser species? That simply wouldn't do. "Don't let him fool you," the Queen growled warningly, easily deflecting every one of the betrayer's frantic blows. "You think their kind will ever truly accept you?" She backhanded the betrayer so hard the metal floor dented where he fell. "Stop this foolishness and kill the sepsis. Return to your place with us." "Shut up!" Max screamed as he scrambled back onto all fours. Everything hurt. He really should have gone on a hunt or two. He felt useless, but if he stopped now, "You can't tell me what to do anymore." The Queen scowled and prowled forward when the runt simply wouldn't stay down. "And this mate you've attached yourself to," she hissed, swiping out to catch the runt across his chest. He didn't cower as he ought. He even tried to claw her back, though that was never going to happen. She knocked his paws away and kicked him hard, yet he still wouldn't heal. He was stronger now than when he had been her personal plaything, but it didn't matter. He was still just a runt. Maybe there was hope for him to become something more yet. "I've seen the girl, Sepsis, you've been hanging on to like a lost puppy," she hissed, though her tone shifted into mock sadness. "And even I can see that she doesn't find you worthy. This new life you've been living is an illusion, my pet," she purred, watching her fallen toy heave up blood from the damage his ill-fated defiance of her had wrought. "Max, come home with us." He coughed. His mouth tasted like copper, and every muscle in his body ached. How did Cáel do this every day? Blood pounded in his ears, and all he could hear, all he could feel, were the results of her. Her claws are cut deep, and every breath he took hurt, but a small, manic laugh managed to bubble its way up from the inside of him, along with the realization that he might not see tomorrow. "You're not going back," he told her, scurrying defensively out of her reach and pulling his legs under himself, though his knees shook too hard to stand. "You're going to die here. Cáel will make sure of that, the moment he is done with your roid-raging lapdog." The Queen tisked disappointedly. "Your body knows what your stupid pride will not accept, Max. I came here to bring you home, because you were my favorite. But you have obviously been stripped of your sanity." She shook her head in disgust at the betrayer. "I thought you were something special, that nature had held a greater purpose for you. I should have let my soldiers eat you." She turned away from the deformity and approached her remaining pet. He still fought valiantly against the dark-haired sepsis. It was all his fault anyway. If he hadn't found the runt, her soldiers would have, and they would have eaten their fill. Max's heart clenched in his chest, her disappointment in him so strong he felt it like his own, though it was overshadowed by something else entirely. Something he'd been feeling more and more over the short time he'd been in the city. Clarity. She was going to kill Cáel, and he wouldn't see it coming because he literally had his hands full of overgrown guardian. Max roared, using his remaining strength to force himself up and rush the Queen. She couldn't get to Cáel. They couldn't lose this fight. Max had finally found salvation, and it may have been scarred and wrapped up in about 90 kilos of batshit psycho, but it was still better than the hell he'd experienced under her rule. She could not take this away from him. He was thinking far too loudly. His lungs seized when her hand wrapped around his neck. Cáel only watched long enough to make sure the last guardian wouldn't move again. Max's battle cry had vibrated through him, and he felt the desperation in it. He turned to the sight of the Queen's teeth buried in the half-breed's neck, and his blood ran cold. Max seemed to be more in shock than pain. He didn't move. Cáel couldn't either. "Max." The sound of his name broke the Memph out of his surprised stupor, and he elbowed the Queen hard enough that even the scout heard something break. Her mouth tore away from him, coughing as her diaphragm spasmed. Max seemed to fall in slow motion. How Cáel got there in time to catch him was irrelevant. The Memph's body twitched and jerked in his arms, a large chunk of flesh missing from the place where Max's shoulder and neck met, before he fell limp. "Well, don't the two of you make such a pretty picture," the Queen sneered, once she'd got her breathing back under control. "I do understand. You got bored of killing, so you decided to play instead. At least with me, he knew his place. I didn't give him false hope for anything better. You are cruel, Sepsis, while I am merciful." Cáel rose slowly. Blood from his sword dripped to the floor and sizzled against the metal. A rage built up inside him he'd never felt before, as the Queen spoke nonsense to the deaf. It made his hands shake, and he turned yellow eyes on the mother of all bitches. A manic smile split his face when she faltered in her gabbing and flinched. It was enough. The time for play was over. Max rolled over slowly. He could smell blood. Not surprising with the corpses that shared the floor with him, but this was different. His tongue scraped cool metal until he tasted something familiar. Cáel hadn't fought like this since the day he'd found the Heckarts. His limbs moved on autopilot. He dodged all the Queen's attacks and found openings he'd usually miss when he was simply in a blackout rage brawl. Just because the opening was there didn't mean that he always hit his mark. She was something else entirely from the norm. He may have had her on the back foot, but she fought smart, gave as good as she got. Rage sang through his veins and his muscles burned, but it wasn't blinding. He dodged the corpse she threw at him and laughed as it sailed over his head. Missed me, now you gotta... on second thoughts. He stopped to pull a face and cut right to avoid her claws. Never mind. He lunged, and she held as his blade sliced through her thigh. She backhanded him so hard that he crashed into the systems board and couldn't help thinking that he'd have bruises where all the little buttons indented uncomfortably into his spine. The structure beneath him sparked and he launched himself off it when the Queen landed a blow exactly where he'd lain, deforming the console even further. "You are getting on my nerves, fangless," she growled, spitting venom with her mounting frustration that the little sepsis wouldn't die. "Stand still and accept your fate. You watched us through him, right?" Cáel grinned. "Don't know if you noticed, but I'm not particularly one for following orders. I saw you laying in a cold sweat and pathetically resist greatness," the Queen smirked. "It's a pity Mother Nature didn't deem you fit to be one of us. You would have made a handsome monster. I have it, on rather good authority, that I was one long before the outbreak, sweet cheeks." Cáel grinned, willingly taking her claws across his arm so he could get in close and slice her hide open. "I was the original before it became cool." "It's not too late," she purred, dancing out of the way of his blade before it did too much damage. Her cuts burned and sizzled, but she was not like the others. She had a higher purpose. One little bite. That's all it would take to become the monster you were always meant to be. "Been there, tried that," he laughed, following her footsteps as they circled one another. He stopped and opened his arms challengingly. Clearly, it didn't work. He lunged for her face, though she had seen it through his childish attempt to bait her. She jumped out of the way and smiled sadly. "Too bad. I'll just have to kill you." The disfigured console sparked and the remaining generators whirled. There was no fire, no explosion, and no loud boom as he'd joked would happen when Dylan had first presented the designs for the city. Everything simply went dark. Nothing moved in the blackness that was what remained below the field. Even the remaining MEVs seemed to be having trouble adjusting to the sudden abyss. "What's going on?" Yana murmured. Panic settled deep in her gut. Between the sun having set, the canopy blocking out the moonlight from above, and the loss of power below, she couldn't even see the gun at the end of her arms, much less anything beyond it. She forced herself to breathe evenly when something in the corner of her eye caught her attention. A glowing something fluttered to the floor. It looked like a leaf. Green light glowed from above them. It grew brighter and brighter as the canopy that separated the top floor turned acid green. "It's glowing," Silas breathed, awe evident in his voice as he gazed up at the luminescent foliage. "It's beautiful." "I didn't know Cebus trees glowed," Maish gasped, subconsciously taking a step towards the stunning mythical display. "Maish, behind you!" Yana screamed. The Queen lashed out just as the illumination reached the lowest level, and Cáel hadn't seen it coming. He put his arms up to defend himself, and the Cebus cell was ripped from his bracer. The weapon powered down instantly, and her claws cut long gashes into his chest when she swiped at him again. His hull cut off as she took the opening. She tackled him to the floor. The impact pushed all the air from the human's lungs, and she lunged as she grabbed the arm attached to that blasted blade. She shoved the heel of her palm into the point of his shoulder and sighed into the satisfying snap as it popped out of place. The sepsis choked on a scream, and she reveled in it. "This has been fun, fangless," she purred, the blood they'd drawn both sizzling between them as hers dripped down onto his. "But now it is time to die." She dug her claws in under his jaw and forced him to bare his neck. She could practically taste him already. His flavor was so strong in her throat, and the sauce would be so much better. "I'm going to eat you whole," she whispered, and he growled in defiance, but they both knew she had won. The weight slammed into her from behind, shoved her chest to chest with her prey. She'd barely noticed the sound of his shoulder click back into place before the human's hands framed her face. Sharp fangs tore into the back of her neck, and she barely had more than a moment to look surprised before the life drained from her eyes. The Queen's head flopped, lifeless, onto Cáel's aching shoulder, and he resisted the urge to laugh in relief. He tried to push the corpse off, but Max crouched over them, caging the bodies under his shifting frame. The Memph was breathing heavily, and his claws scraped the metal floor beneath the human's head as he kept searching for something. He was stone still, eyes far away as he focused on listening for danger. It was unnerving. "Hey, half-breed," Cáel attempted softly. He tiredly lifted a hand up to hesitantly pat the creature on the head. "Glad to see you're not dead, buddy. I really thought I was going to die there for a moment. Don't tell anyone I said that." He chuckled, trying to break whatever trance the guy seemed to be in. "It'll totally ruin my rep as a fearless bad boy, and, could you get off me now? It's getting hard to breathe." The Memph pushed the patronizing limb away to pin it to the floor above the scout's head. "Max?" Cáel asked, his chuckle turning nervous as the green silhouetted figure leaned down and began sniffing him. "What are you doing? Get off." "Idiot." He couldn't bring himself to put any bite behind the words. The tension in the air felt awfully like a line that even he shouldn't cross. The Memph growled softly and warningly clicked its teeth near the scout's ear. Cáel didn't know how he knew that it meant for him to be still. Surprisingly, he didn't feel the automatic need to challenge it. He didn't even have the urge to cuck out the Memph when the cold nose pressed against his neck and snuffled loudly, before following something up over the Queen's shoulder, along her spikes and down her back. Cáel watched silently as Max lowered his jaws to the cooling flesh of the Queen's body. He sniffed at the carcass experimentally before digging in. Strong jaws broke bone, ripped off chunks of flesh, and swallowed the whole lot down without so much as chewing. "That's gross, dude," Cáel almost gagged, turning his head away from the visceral sight, but the half-breed didn't care to pay him any mind. The scout let his head drop back to the floor, pinned as he was, with what sounded like a starving hyena on top of him. This was probably going to take a while. "Are there any more?" Ndee breathed, fighting against the tremors that had settled into her hands. "Not that I can see," Dylan murmured. He didn't lower his gun either, locked in a crouch. Maish looked around the carnage and shrugged. "Double tap?" Yana's gauntlet whirled excitedly, even if she did look rather pale. "Don't you know it, baby?" "You heard the lady." Silas's voice came over the comms. "Anyone still alive? Get going quickly." "Since when did you start giving orders, rookie?" Yana laughed, stepping into the sea of bodies, and made sure not one of them was so much as twitching. The blonde didn't answer immediately, but when he did, his voice was thick. "Since Damien stopped giving orders. He hasn't sounded off in a while." The two scouts exchanged worried looks. Dylan wasn't freaking out, so he probably didn't know yet. They needed to find their commander, and fast. Max was done with about half the Queen's back when a terrified Memph dropped down the buckled elevator shaft. Cáel felt his muscles twitch for a fight, but he couldn't move under the weight of the feeding creature and his meal. "Hey," he barely managed to murmur to the feasting half-breed. "You want to get that?" Max growled threateningly at the Memph when it hesitantly crept towards his kill. Covered in the blood of their dead queen, and her still fresh flesh caught between his teeth, was certainly something of nightmares. It backtracked so quickly it tripped over one of the guardian bodies. Upon realizing what it had fallen over, the creature shrieked in fear. claws scrabbling against the floor in a thrashing fury of limbs. The man chuckled at the morbidly comic reaction. Max smiled down at him with a mouthful of bloody teeth. The half-breed leaned over the corpse to lick at the red droplets on the scout's cheek. He began shifting back, lightening the load, and let Cáel to breathe easier. Both were surprised when their eyes flashed golden. The terrified nymph yelped in fright and bolted for the exit. "Guess not," Cáel